In 1987, North Korean spy Kim Hyun-hui blew up Korean Air Flight 858, killing all 115 passengers on board. After failing to take a cyanide pill afterwards, she told interrogators it was a direct order from Kim Jong-il that she had no way of backing out of without being killed. The woman was originally sentenced to death, but later pardoned by the South Korean president, who said she was merely a brainwashed victim of the real culprit, the North Korean government. Hyun-hui ended up marrying one of her interrogators, and they live happily ever after with their 2 children. While recording the audio version of his book Charlotte's Web, it took author E.B. White 17 takes to read the death scene of Charlotte. He's said to have walked outside for a breather, come back in, and started crying again every time he got to that moment. In 1184, the King of Germany was conducting a meeting with his noblemen on the 2nd floor of a church when the floor suddenly collapsed. The king, whose seat was on a separate section that didn't collapse, watched in horror as 60 of his noblemen drowned in the cesspit located below that hadn't been emptied out in years. If you were born prematurely, you can thank this man for your life. In the early 1900s, most physicians believed that premature babies were weaklings that were unfit to survive into adulthood and therefore not worth saving. But a sideshow entertainer named Martin Cooney decided to change that with his innovative incubators he called child hatcheries. He would display premature babies at amusement parks around the world through his exhibit called the Infantorium, where visitors could pay 25 cents to view a room full of glass boxes containing tiny babies. Cooney would use the earnings to work with nurses and doctors to do everything he could to keep the babies alive. His goal was to demonstrate to the public that premature babies could be saved with proper care. Through his efforts, Cooney saved over 7,000 lives, and by 1943, nearly every hospital in America had one of his incubators. His work completely changed the public's perception of premature babies and significantly contributed to the development of modern neonatal care. As a teenager, the late rapper Big Pun was an accomplished boxer and basketball player. But after dropping out of school and battling depression, he became severely addicted to food. He gained about 50 pounds a year for the next decade before dying of a massive heart attack at the age of 28 while weighing just under 700 pounds. One of the traditional ways to make Okinawan snake wine is quite horrific. It involves putting the snake on ice until it passes out, after which it is gutted, bled, and sewn back up. When the snake is thawed out and reawakens, it quickly dies in an aggressive, striking manner. In 1977, the wife of Melvin Carr arrived home one morning and found her husband dead on the floor in their garage, along with 2 young women and a man dead in the trunk of his car. Police determined that Melvin had kidnapped them at gunpoint the night before, raped the 2 women, and gassed them all with a hose connected from his car's exhaust to the trunk. Melvin had apparently passed out from the toxic fumes upon opening the trunk to dispose of them and ended up meeting the same fate as his victims. When Jimi Hendrix was 16, his mother died from a ruptured spleen at the young age of 33. But Jimmy's father didn't allow him or his brother to attend the funeral. Instead, he gave them shots of whiskey and told them that this was how men should deal with a loss. After several hours of drinking on board a ferry, Englishwoman Emma Blackwell fell to her death. She'd apparently been imitating Kate Winslet's pose from the Titanic movie and lost her footing before plummeting from the ship. Smile mask syndrome is a psychological condition characterized by prolonged unnatural smiling. It can lead to painful strain of the facial muscles and result in an inability to stop smiling even when agitated or upset. In 1993, Missouri man James Scott damaged a levee on the Mississippi River simply to delay his wife from coming home so that he could party. Instead, the river ended up flooding over 14,000 acres, and the 23-year-old man was sentenced to life in prison for intentionally causing a catastrophe. This 15th century Italian painting is the earliest known depiction of the guinea worm, an awful parasite that has haunted humans for thousands of years. It enters the system through dirty water containing its larva, and grows into a 3-foot-long worm that eventually erupts from the skin, causing an incredibly painful burning sensation. To relieve this, people often splash water onto the affected area, prompting the worm to discharge more larvae into the person's body and start the horrible cycle all over again. There were more than 3.5 million guinea worm cases in 1986, but that number has been significantly reduced in recent years. Armed only with a knife, Master Sergeant Roy Benavides went to assist a 12-man Special Forces team who were surrounded by 1,000 Vietnamese soldiers during the Vietnam War. Following the grueling 6-hour battle, Benavides had 37 puncture wounds, exposed intestines, and a broken jaw. He was pronounced dead until he managed to spit blood in the face of the man who was zipping up his body bag. Benavides eventually made a full recovery and was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions. A woman from Turkey recently underwent surgery to have 35 olive pits, 28 date seeds, and 5 stones removed from her digestive tract. She was experiencing severe abdominal pain, leading to the discovery that she'd been swallowing various pits and seeds for decades. After narrowly avoiding death due to the complications, she's now vocal about urging people to never swallow large seeds. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, General Eisenhower was under so much stress that he'd been smoking 6 packs of cigarettes, drinking 24 cups of coffee, and averaging just 2 hours of sleep every day. In the 1950s, 3 campers were found dead at their campsite in Oregon without any sign of struggle. Investigators were stumped until they soon found a dead newt in the hunter's coffee pot. They likely died after drinking the coffee, since newts can produce a toxin that's 10,000 times more potent than cyanide. Ancient Greek lawmaker Charondas issued a law stating that anyone who brought weapons into the Athenian assembly would be executed. One day after hunting in the countryside, he entered the assembly without knowing that his hunting knife was still attached to his belt. He then promptly took his own life to uphold his own law. In 1997, the Cat in the Hat Thanksgiving Day parade float careened out of control due to high winds, knocking a lamppost into the head of Kathleen Carana, putting her in a month-long coma. She sued Macy's and the city for $395 million and ended up settling for an undisclosed amount in 2001. Kathleen eventually purchased a nice New York City apartment with the settlement money, but just 5 years later, Yankees pitcher Corey Lidle crashed his plane into her building and the engine ended up in her bedroom. Luckily, the crash happened just minutes before Kathleen was due to arrive home, but Lidle and his flight instructor were both killed while 21 others in the building were injured. Adding to the weirdness of this story, the flight instructor's friend was also supposed to be on this flight but got stuck in traffic and told them to leave without him. So he managed to escape death until just 1 month later when he was killed in a separate plane crash. In 2017, British hairdresser Daryl Rowe was convicted of deliberately infecting 5 men with HIV. He would meet his victims through dating apps before sleeping with them, after which he would send them taunting messages telling them he lied about being HIV negative. Rowe ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment for his evil actions. In 1966, an 18-year-old man entered a beauty school in Arizona before shooting 7 people inside, killing 5 of them including a toddler. When questioned about his motive, he said he simply did it to get his name out there. Doctor and philanthropist Patch Adams only agreed to the 1999 film about his life because the producers promised to help build his hospital. But none of the profits from the film were ever given to his foundation, and Adams himself said he hated the movie and everything it stood for. In 1955, a pregnant woman was scheduled for a C-section in Morocco, but she fled the hospital after watching another woman die during the procedure. She was in pain for a few days afterwards, but when the pain suddenly disappeared, she simply went on with her life. 46 years later, she was diagnosed with a tumor that turned out to be the calcified baby still inside of her. When Brian Spencer was called up to play in his first NHL game in 1970, he told his father Roy to watch the game that night since he knew he'd be interviewed between periods. But when he couldn't find a broadcast of the game, Roy drove to the nearest TV station in a fury and held the staff at gunpoint, ordering them to broadcast the Maple Leafs game immediately. The station complied, but as Roy was leaving the building, he was confronted by Canadian police and eventually killed after a standoff. The hockey player's life would end up spiraling out of control, as he would also be killed in a shootout after trying to rob his crack dealer. Wow, nice family, huh? During a hunting trip in 1913, race car driver Kamil Janatsky hid behind a bush and made animal noises to prank his friend before he was promptly shot. He was rushed to the hospital but died on his way there, fulfilling his own prediction that he would die in a Mercedes. In 1970, U.S. Air Force pilot Captain William Schaffner was ordered to follow a UFO over the North Sea when he ended up vanishing without a trace. A few weeks later, Schaffner's aircraft was found by divers and recovered from the sea. Strangely, its cockpit was sealed and the ejector seat was intact, but Schaffner's body Schaffner's body was nowhere to be found. While on vacation in Bulgaria in 2014, 28-year-old German man Lars Mittank got into a bar fight that left him with a ruptured eardrum. He was unable to fly home with his friends due to the injuries, but told them he was totally fine and only planned on staying for a couple extra nights. However, the next day, Lars began acting paranoid. He called his mom and whispered that she should cancel his credit cards because someone was trying to kill him. Security cams in the hotel showed him pacing up and down the halls and peeking out the windows for several hours. After arriving at the airport the next day, Lars saw the airport doctor who gave him the okay to fly. But that's when Lars began shaking and suddenly yelled, "I don't want to die here. I have to get out of here." He then got up and sprinted from the office, leaving behind all of his luggage, including his phone, wallet, and ID. Once outside, he was seen jogging from the airport, hopping a fence, and sprinting in the direction of a nearby forest. Lars would never be seen again. RFK Jr.'s gravelly speaking voice is caused by a rare neurological condition he developed in his early 40s called spasmodic dysphonia, which causes the muscles that open and close the vocal cords to spasm involuntarily. Here's what he used to sound like before this condition versus after.
And if somebody dumps something into the river that's poison, and it goes into a drinking water intake, and children drink that drinking water, that is child abuse.
I think those vaccines we need to have, again, true double-blind placebo-controlled trials on that. There's 25% of Americans.
While the true cause is unknown, people who do a lot of public speaking are far more likely to develop this condition. RFK required a titanium bridge in his vocal folds to be able to speak at all, and receives Botox shots in his vocal cords every 4 months. He says it's painful to hear himself speak and feels sorry for those who have to listen to him. In 2006, 26-year-old Illinois teacher and wrestler Samson Shelton admitted to police that he raped a 17-year-old student before choking her and tossing her body into a wooded area. He then put a belt around her neck to make it look like she was strangled and left her for dead, after which Shelton went line dancing with friends. Suffering from brain damage and a broken neck, the teenager survived but had to relearn how to swallow, walk, and talk. But despite his heinous crimes, Shelton was released on parole just last year after serving out 17 of his 20-year prison sentence. In 2008, a train traveling 70 miles an hour struck and killed an 18-year-old man who was running across the tracks and apparently didn't realize how fast the train was moving. The impact flung the man's body over 100 feet, and his flying body parts knocked a 58-year-old woman to the ground, breaking her wrist, shoulder, and leg. The woman later sued the man's family on the basis that, if you did something as stupid as this guy did, you have to be responsible for what comes from it. A teenager from Brazil recently died in one of the strangest ways you'll ever hear of. He crushed up a dead butterfly and mixed the remains with water before injecting the liquid into his leg with a syringe. After continuously vomiting and limping several days later, he was taken to the hospital where he stayed for more than a week before eventually dying from septic shock. The boy never gave a reason for injecting the insect into his bloodstream. Up until 2017, if you caught your spouse in bed with someone else in Uruguay, it was within your legal right to murder either one of them. In 1997, struggling father of 3 Billy Bob Harrell Jr. became a millionaire overnight after winning the $31 million jackpot in the Texas lottery. But as friends, family, and strangers continuously pressured him to share his fortune, Harrell's spending went out of control, eventually resulting in he and his wife's divorce. Just 2 years after winning the lottery, Harrell ended up taking his own life just a few days after telling his friend, "Winning the lottery is the worst thing that ever happened to me." Talented artist Norman Lee worked for Marvel Comics for nearly 20 years until he suddenly disappeared in 2015. He was snorkeling in the Cayman Islands with his wife but never returned ashore, and his body was never found. In 1996, 16-year-old Jonathan Capewell died as a result of his obsession to smell good. The teenager covered his entire body in cologne at least twice per day until he eventually died from a heart attack. At the time of his death, Capewell had 10 times the lethal dosage of butane in his blood after the gas built up in his body for several months. In 1974, a group of 6 men entered the hi-fi audio store in Utah and held everyone inside hostage. The hostages were then subjected to brutal torture, including being forced to drink drain cleaner, which left them with horrible burns in their throats and mouths. One of the victims had a ballpoint pen inserted into his ear that was stomped on until it punctured his eardrum and came out his throat. All 5 hostages were later shot in the head, 3 of whom died. 2 of the perpetrators were sentenced to death, while the 3 other men involved were never caught. In October of 2011, famed narrator David Attenborough found a skull in the garden of his London property. He immediately informed police, who later determined the skull belonged to the victim of a gruesome murder during the Victorian era. Julia Martha Thomas was killed by her housemaid in 1879 before being chopped up, boiled, and fed to local children. There's a room in the basement of Oregon State Hospital known today as the Room of Forgotten Souls. In 2004, hundreds of copper cans were discovered holding the remains of 3,600 mental patients who were cremated on site starting in 1917. Built in 1628, the Swedish warship Vasa was hailed as the greatest warship ever built, but infamously sank just 20 minutes into its maiden voyage, resulting in the deaths of at least 30 people. After it was salvaged in 1961, archaeologists found that the ship was horribly asymmetrical. Apparently, some of the builders had measured in Swedish feet, which was 12 inches, while others had measured in Amsterdam feet, which was 11 inches. The ship was knocked over by a mild gust of wind less than a mile into its voyage. Children's entertainer and YouTuber Stephen John, aka Blippi, hasn't always been so family-friendly. He began his career as a gross-out video creator under the name Steezy Grossman, and would post shocking videos of himself performing grotesque acts across illicit websites. Most infamously, he performed the Harlem Shake in 2013 while standing unclothed on a toilet and defecated all over his unclothed friend. Despite Steven's regret and extensive efforts to have the video removed from the internet, it can still be found rather easily. Don't try to find it. Please don't. Oh my god, why did I watch it? What the fuck, Blippi? In 2013, unemployed 30-year-old Princeton graduate Thomas Gilbert Jr. shot and killed his hedge fund manager father just hours after being told his $1,000 weekly allowance would be cut down to just $300. He was sentenced to at least 30 years in prison. A Japanese pilot who bombed a town in Oregon during World War II returned 20 years later to present his family's 400-year-old sword as a symbol of regret. His daughter said that if he had received a negative reaction, he would have used the sword to perform seppuku on himself instead. In 1899, brothers George and Willie Muse were kidnapped from their farm in Virginia by a freak hunter when they were just little boys. Born with albinism, they were forced to perform in circuses for the next 25 years under the names the Sheep-Headed Cannibals and Ambassadors from Mars. They were often ordered to partake in disturbing acts such as biting the heads off of snakes or consuming raw meat in front of crowds. The brothers essentially worked as modern-day slaves until their mother found them working for the Ringling Brothers and successfully sued for their release. In 2002, German actor Gunther Kaufmann confessed to falling on his accountant during a fight and accidentally suffocating the man to death with his 260-pound body. The actor was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in prison as a result of the incident. But 3 years later, it was revealed that Kaufman was innocent and had only confessed to protect his dying wife, who had actually murdered the accountant. After a night of drinking in 2010, Michigan man Jeffrey Duthette was sleeping in his bed when his dog Kiko suddenly bit off his toe. When he went to the hospital, it turned out the toe had a bad infection that likely would have spread and killed Jerry if left untreated. Thus, the dog had saved his owner's life. In 2010, Dr. Jacqueline Koterick tried breaking into her ex-boyfriend's home by climbing down his chimney. 3 days later, a house sitter discovered her decomposing body inside after she apparently died from mechanical asphyxia. In 2008, a woman from China cut off her husband's beaver cleaver with scissors while he was sleeping, after he reportedly brought another woman home and requested a threesome. While the man was recovering from the surgery that reattached it, his wife cut it off again and threw it out the window. In 1989, Montana woman Patricia Meehan was driving on the wrong side of the highway and eventually crashed into another car. She emerged from her vehicle with a confused look on her face before climbing over a fence and staring back at the wreckage. Patricia stood there for a few moments before wandering into the open field behind her and disappearing into the night. Despite hundreds of reported sightings of her in the months that followed, she hasn't been located to this day. Some investigators suspect Patricia suffered from amnesia as a result of head trauma, but the case remains unsolved. The Babushka Lady was the name given to an unidentified person who was present at JFK's assassination in 1963. He or she was seen filming before and after the president was shot in the head, but later disappeared into the crowd. That recording may have been crucial in revealing the truth about JFK's killing, but the person has never come forward with the footage. Austrian Mayor Hans Steininger died in 1567 after breaking his neck by tripping on his own ridiculously long beard while running from a house fire. In 2010, a Russian man died after being voluntarily buried alive by his friends. He was simply trying to overcome his irrational fear of dying when the ground suddenly caved in and crushed him. In 2008, a British woman died in one of the most embarrassing ways possible. Her husband admitted he would hook homemade clamps to the woman's nipples and administer electric shocks to turn her on. Apparently, it went a little too far this one time, and the woman was electrocuted to death. The husband was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to at least 20 years in prison. Cult leader Amy Carlson, aka Mother God, convinced her followers that she was God, a 19 billion-year-old being, and that she could heal people from cancer with the power of love. Amy claimed she had reincarnated 534 times, with her past lives including Cleopatra, Jesus Christ, Harriet Tubman, and Marilyn Monroe. But Amy's health began to rapidly decline after she herself was reportedly diagnosed with cancer in 2020. She was eventually paralyzed from the neck down and begged her members to take her to the hospital, but they refused, and she ended up dying in April of 2021 at the age of 46. When police were alerted, they found her mummified corpse in a state of decay that suggested she'd been dead for several weeks. It was stuffed in a sleeping bag wrapped with Christmas lights, with the face covered in glitter and both eyes removed. Authorities stated it was a makeshift shrine and ended up charging 7 members of the group with desecration of a corpse. In 1966, James Meredith, the first black man to attend the University of Mississippi, planned a one-man, 220-mile march against fear to encourage black people to vote. But despite a police presence just 2 days into the march, James was shot in the neck, back, and head by a white supremacist. He was quickly rushed to the hospital and ended up surviving his wounds, while his attacker only received 2 years in prison. Later that same year, James completed the march, by which point over 10,000 people had joined him. James is now 91 and still lives in Mississippi. Depression-era gangster John Dillinger survived a shootout with the FBI, robbed 24 banks and 4 police stations, had plastic surgery to change his face and remove his fingerprints, escaped from prison using a wooden gun, and led the government on a year-long chase that cost them 4 times the amount he had ever stolen. After Dillinger was finally shot and killed by the FBI in 1934, bystanders rushed to the theater where he was killed to soak their handkerchiefs in his blood, while thousands stormed Chicago's morgue to have their photos taken with his corpse.